Hey guys, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you are in the world, whether it's the middle of the night or you're just winding down, welcome. If you enjoy this kind of gentle storytelling, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely find it helpful. And let me know in the comments what time it is for you and where you're tuning in from. I love reading your replies. All right, take a deep breath and let's begin. It was a quiet morning in the city of Chang'an. The sky was still pale, just beginning to turn blue as the sun yawned behind the hills. A gentle breeze brushed through the tiled rooftops of the city, stirring the soft red silk that hung from the wooden windows. In a small courtyard near the outer market, a man stirred from his sleep. His name was Lin Wei, and today was the beginning of a very long journey. Lin Wei was a silk merchant, not the kind who stayed in one place, but the kind who traveled. He traded silk, spices, and fine goods between the great cities of the East and the distant lands of the West. Places with names like Samarkand, Persia, and even Rome. He rose slowly, the way a man does when he knows the day will be long. He wrapped a light robe over his shoulders and stepped into the courtyard where a bowl of water waited. He splashed his face, waking his senses, then stood still for a moment, listening to the birds. The market was not yet awake, but the smell of steamed rice and tea was already drifting from nearby homes. He smiled softly. It would be many weeks before he smelled this again. His caravan was nearly ready. There were camels waiting outside the city gate, along with boxes of silk packed tightly in lacquered chests. A few crates held bundles of fine paper, tea bricks, and spices, all valuable cargo along the Silk Road. But before he left, he had one more thing to do. He walked to a small wooden shrine near the courtyard wall and placed a bundle of incense at its base. Lighting it with a long match, he whispered a quiet prayer, for safety, for trade, for the long road ahead. Lin Wei stepped into his boots and tightened the cloth around his waist. Outside his gate, a boy waited with a small satchel of dried fruit and flatbread, a gift from a neighbor. Lin nodded, gave a kind smile, and accepted it with thanks. Small gestures like this were common in Chang'an, a city built on tradition and warmth. The road began just beyond the eastern gate of the city. This wasn't just a street, it was the Silk Road, the most important trade route in the ancient world. It stretched across deserts, mountains, and valleys, linking the east with the west for thousands of miles. His caravan gathered slowly. There were 7 camels in all, each tied together with thick ropes and loaded with crates and bundles. 2 young men from the city, apprentices, would help guide them through the early part of the journey. He paused for a moment near the gate and looked back. Chang'an stood proud, wide avenues, strong walls, and elegant towers that faded into the morning mist. He had left it many times before, but it always felt the same, like turning the last page of a familiar book. The guards at the gate recognized him and waved him through without question. He was a known traveler, a merchant trusted by the local guilds. As the sun lifted behind them, the caravan moved forward, step by steady step. The camels grunted softly, their feet pressing into the soft dirt road. Lin walked beside the lead animal, one hand on its reins, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The wind carried the smell of wheat fields and wildflowers. The land was still green here, near the edge of the city. But in a few days, it would turn to dry hills and then to desert. He pulled his light scarf over his nose and mouth, not for warmth, but for dust. The journey had truly begun. The days moved slowly at first. Lin Wei and his caravan walked from morning until evening, with short rests under shade whenever they could find it. The road here was still gentle. Soft hills, small farms, and villages tucked between the trees. Each village they passed had something to offer. In one, they stopped for water. A boy filled their flasks from a stone well, while chickens pecked at the dust nearby. In another, an old woman gave them a bundle of dried peaches, laughing that they were just sweet enough to chase the thirst. The camels moved with quiet patience. They did not complain, only swayed gently with each step. Lin Wei had traveled with these animals before. He knew which ones liked to lead, which ones were easily startled, and which ones would try to eat everything along the way. At night, they camped near a quiet stream. Lin would unpack a rolled mat, stretch his legs, and sip hot tea made over a small fire. The stars overhead were so many that it felt like the sky had opened into another world. He would lie back and think of the cities ahead, Dunhuang, Kashgar, and beyond. Each one was a step closer to the great bazaars of Persia and the gold coins of the West. But Lin wasn't rushing. He never did. The road was not just about trade. It was a way of life. Each moment along the path mattered. He listened to the crackling fire, the snorts of the camels, and the quiet wind through the trees. It was enough. Sleep came gently. The mountains faded behind them. Now the land softened once more, sloping down into a dry plain filled with golden grass and scattered rocks. The air grew warmer, and in the distance green shimmered, a rare sight in these parts, an oasis. The city of Dunhuang was near. Lin Wei's eyes narrowed as he spotted the tall clay walls rising quietly from the earth. Palm trees waved in the wind just beyond the gate, and the sound of bells drifted through the dry air, faint but welcoming. Dunhuang was more than a stop. It was a meeting place, a hub where Eastern traders crossed paths with Western travelers. Silk met spices, words met stories, and cultures melted together like colors in warm water. As they entered through the open gates, the smells changed. Cinnamon, cooked lamb, roasted nuts, and ink from scroll shops. Children played in the streets. Merchants called out prices. Flags of different shapes and colors flapped from wooden beams. Some people wore robes like Lin's. Others wore tall hats, golden earrings, or long cloaks stitched with blue thread. Lin smiled softly. He led the caravan through the market road, past stalls selling dates, honey, pottery, scrolls, and even small ivory carvings. Some of the local boys pointed at the camels and laughed. One tried to pet a camel's nose and quickly jumped back when it huffed at him. They reached the caravanserai, a large rest stop for traders. Inside there were rooms for sleeping, food for the animals, and large baths with clean water. Lin Wei removed his boots and stepped into the cool shade of the stone archway. A breeze passed through the hall like a sigh. He would rest here for 2 days, wash, eat, sell some goods, and prepare for the next leg of the journey. For now, though, he simply wanted tea and quiet. He took a seat on the soft carpet floor, leaned back against a wall painted with clouds and birds, and closed his eyes. That evening, the market came alive with color. Lanterns hung from wooden beams, glowing softly in red, orange, and yellow. Musicians sat on corners playing flutes and stringed instruments. A woman sold candied fruit on sticks. A boy chased a wooden hoop through the crowd. Lin Wei walked slowly, his robe freshly washed, his sandals light on the stone. He passed a group of monks reciting prayers, a bookseller offering scrolls written in 3 languages, and an old man carving a chessboard from smooth black wood. At one stall, Lin paused. Silk, not from his own region, but from the south, deep green with golden flowers. The fabric shimmered under the lantern light. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the seller asked, smiling. Lin nodded. "Yes. It tells a story without words." He spoke for a while, not about price, but about weather, roads, and tea. This was how merchants worked. Trust was more valuable than coins. Lin bought a small length of fabric, not for trade, but for his mother. She would like the color. He wandered until the moon rose high, then returned to the caravanserai. There, under a quiet roof and beside his resting camels, he lay down. The sounds of the market faded, as the night breeze touched his face. And once again, sleep arrived like an old friend. After 2 full days of rest, Lin Wei and his caravan stepped once more onto the road. They moved west now, deeper into the lands beyond Dunhuang. The mountains behind them faded into memory, and in their place came wide plains and deep blue skies. The wind here carried a different scent, drier, colder, with hints of foreign trees and stone. This stretch of the Silk Road was quieter. Villages were few, and most travelers came in small groups. Other merchants, monks, or guards escorting noble letters across kingdoms. Some waved to Lin as they passed. Others simply nodded and moved on. Each day the land changed slightly. One morning, they passed stone pillars marked with foreign writing, Persian perhaps, or the language of the Sogdians. Another evening, they camped near a ruined outpost with crumbling walls where wild goats wandered. Lin liked these quiet places. Here the noise of the market was far behind, and the only sounds were wind, hooves, and fire crackling at night. He often sat under the stars with a small journal in his lap, writing short notes about the journey. How the land looked, what was traded, the names of kind faces he met. These notes were never meant to be sold, they were memories. And in the quiet of the Western Road, memories were the only company that never left. On the fourth day beyond Dunhuang, Lin met a stranger. It happened near a shallow river, where both parties had stopped to water their animals. The man wore a dark green robe stitched with gold thread. His eyes were sharp, his beard short, and on his hand a single ring with a blue stone. He spoke slowly, with a thick accent. Not Chinese, but not fully foreign either. A language shaped by travel. They greeted each other, shared tea, and sat on opposite sides of the fire that evening. The stranger carried glass beads, small vials of perfume, and a pouch of golden coins. Roman, perhaps, though old and faded. He showed one to Lin, who turned it in his fingers, studying the strange face carved into the metal. "Powerful king?" Lin asked. The stranger laughed. "Forgotten one." They didn't trade much that night. It's only a small bundle of silk for a carved bronze pendant. But Lin valued the meeting not for the goods, but for the moment. Two merchants from different worlds sharing warmth and silence beside the same fire. That was the true magic of the Silk Road. On the fifth morning, the green hills gave way to rocky ground. The road narrowed. Trees became fewer. The air was dry, and dust rose from every footstep. They had entered the edge of the desert. This part of the Silk Road was known to test a merchant's patience. The wind was hot in the day and cold at night. Water became precious, and the sun sat high for hours without mercy. Linway adjusted the scarf over his face and checked each camel's water supply. They had prepared carefully. Large water skins were tied to each saddle, and sun hats shaded their faces. Still, the heat made everything slow. Landscape was quiet now, not silent, but different. The wind moved across the sand with a soft hiss. Shadows shifted across the rocks as the day passed. At noon, they stopped beside a cluster of sharp stones. Lin tied a cloth between two wooden poles to make shade. There they ate dried fruit, flatbread, and strips of salty beef. Nobody talked much. Even the camels lay still. Lin studied the map he had drawn himself, marked with simple ink lines, notes from other merchants, and symbols for safe wells and danger zones. He knew this route well, but deserts could always surprise a traveler. He sipped from his flask and looked out over the horizon. It shimmered in waves across the land, but far in the distance, the faint shape of a watchtower stood, a sign that a rest stop was near. It would take another full day to reach it. But he smiled. The journey had many miles left, and that was exactly what he wanted. By the time the sun had begun to lean west, Lin Wei saw it clearly. A small square tower made of stone and sand-colored bricks stood on a low hill, its shadow long and still. This was one of the many old watchtowers built to guide merchants and protect the trade route from raiders or wild animals. Some were still guarded, but many were empty now, quiet, forgotten sentinels of the desert. As the caravan approached, The camels lifted their heads. They knew what it meant: rest, water, safety. Linway led them to the base of the tower, where a narrow well still held cool water deep below. Using a wooden pulley, they filled bowls for the camels first, then the men. Inside the tower's shade, it was much cooler. The walls were thick, made to trap the heat outside. There were carvings on the stone, names, symbols, dates. Travelers from long ago had left their marks, as if saying, "I was here, I made it this far." Lin ran his fingers over the worn symbols. He had passed this tower many times before. It never looked different, but it always felt important. That night, they stayed there. The camels rested in the soft sand, their legs tucked under them. The apprentices slept with their backs against the tower's wall, wrapped in light cloth to keep the chill away. Lin sat at the doorway, sipping warm tea again, his mind drifting. He thought about his father, who once made this same journey. He remembered stories of sandstorms and thieves, and of a blue gemstone he once traded for a bundle of silk. He smiled quietly, looking up at the stars. The desert could be harsh, but under this sky it was beautiful too. The next day began as usual, quiet and dry. But by midday, the wind had changed. It started as a soft push, then became stronger. The air turned yellow and dry. Linway noticed the shift before the others. He stopped walking and looked up. The sky was no longer clear. It was hazy, thick with dust. "A storm," he said softly. The apprentices looked at him with concern. He moved quickly. The camels were tied together more tightly. Their faces were covered with light cloth. The crates were pulled down and laid flat. Then Lin and the others wrapped their own faces, lowered their heads, and sat close to the ground. The wind howled. Sand flew through the air like smoke, scratched their skin, and filled the sky. The sun disappeared behind the yellow cloud. The storm was not dangerous if you were prepared, but it made time stop. They sat in silence, huddled low. The sound was like 1,000 whispers shouting at once. It passed after some time, maybe an hour, maybe more. Time moved differently in storms like that. When the wind finally calmed, the world was coated in dust. The sky returned, pale and washed out. Linway stood slowly, brushed the sand from his robe, and checked each camel. They were all safe. No one said much. They packed in silence, eyes squinting against the wind's memory. And then, step by slow step, they kept walking. 2 days after the sandstorm, the path began to change once more. The endless dunes turned into rocky cliffs. The ground rose in gentle slopes, and the sky felt closer, bluer. In the quiet of this new terrain, the merchant caravan came upon a narrow canyon, a place Linway knew well. At the far end of the canyon, hidden behind a curtain of stone and time, was something special. An old cave. Not just any cave, but one known to travelers along the Silk Road for its walls covered in paintings. Linway guided the caravan toward the opening. It was a low arch carved by nature, worn smooth by wind and years. Inside, the cave was cool and dim. The light outside barely reached the walls. But what it touched was magical. Paintings. Hundreds of them. Simple, colorful scenes made with natural dyes. Reds from earth, blacks from ash, gold from flowers. They showed travelers on horseback, camels crossing rivers, birds in the sky, and strange creatures from old stories. Some paintings were faded, others still bright. Linway stood still for a long time, just breathing in the quiet. This was a sacred place, though no one said so aloud. Merchants did not touch the walls. They simply sat and watched, remembering that others had walked this road before them, and would walk it again. He lit a small oil lamp and sat cross-legged beneath a painting of a great bird flying over a city. The wind outside whispered across the stones. One of the apprentices stared wide at the colors, his mouth open in wonder. They did not speak, simply rested, listened, and let the quiet fill the air like warm tea in an old cup. The next morning, they climbed. The road wound upward now, hugging the side of the hills. The wind was sharper here, and the sky was a deeper blue. Trees began to appear again, small, tough trees with roots that clung to rock. This was the beginning of the mountain pass, a narrow trail that led traders over the high ridges and into the lands beyond the desert. Lin Wei guided the led camel slowly. The animal moved with care, its large feet pressing down on loose stone. Behind them, the others followed step by step. Below, the land stretched out in shades of gold and gray. The desert they had crossed, the air smelled different, cooler, fresher. They reached the top of the pass by afternoon. There, the trail widened for a short time, and Lin stopped the group. They unpacked dried noodles and small bundles of greens. Using hot water from their flasks, they prepared a simple meal and ate quietly, sitting on stones. One of the apprentices pointed at the distant ridge and asked if it was the border to the western lands. Lin nodded slowly. Soon, he said, the world will change again. Clouds drifted above them like silk scarves. The sun moved slowly toward the edge of the world. They sat still for a while, watching the shadows stretch across the valley below. In that moment, the mountain held its breath. After many long days and quiet nights, the land began to rise again. In the distance, great towers appeared, not mountains, but man-made structures rising from behind high walls. Blue tiles shimmered like water under the sun. Domes curved gently toward the sky. Flags moved softly in the wind. They had arrived at Samarkand. The ancient city stood at the crossroads of many worlds: Persia, India, China, and the steppes of the north. Here languages blended. Here a man could trade silk for horses, spices for gems, and stories for gold. Lin Wei and his caravan entered through the arched gate. As the morning sun spilled across the stone streets, trumpets called from a nearby palace. Street dogs barked. Children danced in circles while merchants opened their wooden shutters. The bazaar was unlike any other. Stalls stretched in every direction, under tents, inside courtyards, even from carts pulled by donkeys. There were jars of cinnamon and cardamom, strings of copper bells, bolts of cloth and colors he had never seen. Lin walked slowly, taking it all in. A man sold tea made with goat milk and rose petals. A woman offered dried apricots, so sweet they stuck to his fingers. Musicians played lutes and small drums, their rhythms soft and hypnotic. In the heart of the market stood a round fountain, where travelers sat to rest and sip water. Lin sat there too. He looked around, at the faces of people from far-off lands, at the spices in the air, and at the sky above, wide and calm. He had made it. It was only the middle of his journey, but it felt like a dream already. While in Samarkand, Lin Wei had one special errand. He carried with him a sealed letter, written by a scholar in Chang'an, meant for the great library housed inside the palace of Samarkand. The scroll was not for trade. It was a gift, a piece of knowledge offered in friendship between distant lands. The palace gates were guarded by men in silver armor. Their spears gleamed in the sun, but their faces were kind. Lin showed them the scroll, and they nodded, allowing him to pass. Inside, the palace was calm and grand. Walls were painted with golden trees. Pools reflected the blue sky through open courtyards. At the far end, a wide chamber opened, lined with shelves and scrolls. A librarian, an old man with gentle eyes and a white beard, greeted Lin with a soft bow. "You have brought a message," he said, touching the scroll as if it were made of glass. Lin nodded and handed it over. They sat for tea in silence afterward, as scribes carefully unwrapped the scroll and began copying it by hand. On the table nearby sat books written in many languages: Arabic, Sanskrit, Greek, Chinese. Each one carried a voice from somewhere far away. Lin asked to leave a small note in one. He wrote, "Pass through Samarkand on the way to the western seas. May the road stay open for those who follow." He signed it simply. Lin Wei's caravan left Samarkand in the early morning, while mist still curled low along the ground. The road ahead was known among traders as the Orchard Way, a path lined with groves of apricot, fig, and pomegranate trees. It was a short-lived stretch of beauty in a world of stone and dust. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled sweet. Birds sang above their heads as the caravan passed under branches heavy with fruit. The camels walked slower here, their feet quieter on the soft soil. One apprentice reached up and plucked a ripe fig, wiping it clean against his sleeve and smiling as he bit in. Lin smiled too. It was rare, on such a long journey, to feel completely at peace. But this morning gave him that gift. The kind you don't plan for, the kind you just accept. They passed farmers carrying baskets. Some waved. Others offered small bundles of dried apricots in exchange for tea leaves or soft silk scraps. Lin traded without words, only with nods and gestures. Later, they stopped near a small orchard and unpacked lunch. They sat under a broad fig tree where the air was cool and green. Lin poured tea into small cups, while the others chewed quietly on bread and fruit. No sounds of cities, no rush of coins. Only leaves in the wind, the soft breathing of camels, and the warmth of sun through trees. Not long after the orchard road ended, Lin Wei saw dust rising in the distance. Another caravan. He slowed his group and waited. As the figures came into view, he saw they were not carrying silk or spices. They were leading horses, strong animals with thick manes and tall legs, clearly from the grasslands to the north. The two caravans stopped beside a dried riverbed. Lin greeted their leader, a man with sun-dark skin and a calm, weathered face. He wore a woolen tunic, and his belt held a knife shaped like a leaf. They shared water and spoke slowly, exchanging news of the road. The man explained that he was headed east, toward Chang'an, with horses for sale. Lin Wei, headed west, offered tea and cinnamon in return for their company for a night. As the sun set, both groups made camp together. Camels and horses rested in a circle, snorting softly at one another. Fires were lit, stories were told. Songs, strange and soft, rose into the night sky. Lin listened, eyes half closed, the smell of cooking rice and firewood around him. He thought. The road had many faces, traders, scholars, farmers, monks, and horsemen too. Walked the same ground, under the same stars, and each left something behind, even if only a song. As the days passed, the land grew wild again. The road narrowed into valleys shaped by time and wind. Great boulders rose on either side, and distant echoes followed every footstep. It was the kind of place where sound lingered longer, and the sky seemed farther away. In the late afternoon, Lin Wei spotted it, a broken silhouette against the hills, an old fortress half swallowed by stone and ivy. Once, this place had guarded the trade route. Now it stood in quiet ruin. Its towers leaned like tired guards who had seen too many winters. The stone gates were open, their wooden beams long gone. Still, it was a safe place to stop. The caravan entered the outer courtyard, where the ground was flat and shaded. Birds nested in the corners. Wildflowers bloomed between cracks in the stone. The air was cooler here, and even the camels seemed to breathe easier. Lin Wei walked the walls, placing his hand on the sun-warmed stone. He imagined voices from long ago, soldiers shouting, merchants laughing, the clatter of hooves and swords. Now only wind moved here like a whisper remembering. He returned to the group and sat beside the fire. They did not speak much that night, so the silence of the fortress was too deep, too soft to disturb. It felt as if the very stones were dreaming, and so the merchants dreamed too. The next morning, they followed the valley west. There, winding like a ribbon through the hills, ran a river known by travelers as the River of Bright Stones. Its name came from the polished pebbles that filled its bed. Reds, golds, pale greens, and blues. When the sun hit the water just right, the whole river shimmered. The caravan paused at a shallow bend. Lin Wei knelt by the edge, cupping the clear water in both hands. It was cold, sharp, and sweet, the best he had tasted in many days. The camels drank in slow gulps. The apprentices wandered along the shore, laughing softly as they picked up smooth, round stones. One found a stone shaped like a heart. Another found one with a hole right through it. Lin chose a pale blue one the size of a coin. He rubbed it between his fingers, warm from the sun. He thought perhaps he would give it to a child in the next town, a small gift from the river. They stayed by the water for most of the day. It was rare to find such a quiet, lovely place on the road. There were no cities here, no market calls, only wind in the reeds and the soft splash of hooves. In the late afternoon, they packed again and continued forward, their spirits lighter. Behind them, the stones still sparkled in the sun. The caravan had entered a narrow mountain pass. The walls rose steep on either side, and the wind whispered through cracks and crevices. It was a place both beautiful and dangerous, where storms could sweep down without warning. That afternoon the sky darkened suddenly. Lin Wei looked up, a sharp edge of worry in his calm eyes. Clouds rolled in fast, thick and heavy, darkening the blue above. The wind began to pick up, tugging at scarves and ropes. The camels shifted uneasily. Lin quickly called the apprentices to gather supplies and tighten the load. Within minutes, the first drops fell light at first, then growing heavy. Rain hammered down in sheets. Thunder echoed through the rocky walls like distant drums. The caravan stopped near a small cave, tucked into the mountainside. Lin led the animals inside, sheltering from the storm. The sound of rain on stone was loud, but safe. They sat close to each other, wrapped in cloth and silence. Lin closed his eyes, feeling the cool, damp air, the heartbeats of camels, and the rhythm of the storm. It was a reminder that the road was never easy, but it was always worth the journey. After hours, the rain slowed. When Lin stepped outside, the world felt fresh and clean. The mountains glistened with wet stone. Drops hung like jewels on leaves and grasses. And above, a bright rainbow arched across the sky. The apprentices smiled, pointing up. Even the camels seemed to notice, lifting their heads as if in wonder. Lin stood quietly, watching the colors stretch from one ridge to the other. It was a sign of hope. The road would continue. The caravan would keep moving. And no matter what storms came, there was always light after darkness. They packed up slowly and began walking again, the air cool and sweet. The journey was far from over. Several days after the mountain pass, the land began to flatten again. Signs of a great city began to appear. Tall trees planted in rows. Wide roads carved smooth by many wheels, and distant towers rising from the earth like stone sails. They had reached Bukhara, often called the city of 1,000 markets. Here the Silk Road truly came alive. The air was thick with scents, roasted almonds, saffron, smoked lamb, and rose water. Dancers moved through the square. Drums echoed between buildings. Merchants shouted greetings in a dozen languages. Lin Wei moved through the crowd like a river, steady, calm, and unseen. He saw trays of golden raisins, baskets of pale pistachios, and shelves filled with spices he did not recognize. In one alley he passed a table covered in glass, red, green, blue, shaped into birds, horses, and leaves. There were no walls between cultures here, only open doors. Lin traded silk for lapis stones. He offered Chinese tea in return for carved bone combs. He met a man from India, a woman from the north, and a boy who sold paper lanterns strung together with thread made of silver. When the sun dipped low and the markets began to quiet, Lin returned to the caravan. He sat beneath a tree, his robe dusted with the day's walk. Around him, the city still hummed, like a dream with no end. That night, Lin Wei opened a wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside were 2 folded letters. They had arrived weeks ago, passed from one trader to another, hand to hand across the road, from his home in Chang'an all the way to Bukhara. The first was from his younger brother. It spoke of the peach tree in the garden, of their mother's health, of a neighbor's newborn child. Simple words, but each one felt like a warm light inside his chest. The second was written in smaller script, from a close friend, another merchant who had taken the northern route this season. He wrote, "The mountains were heavy with snow this year. I traded tea for amber near the Caspian Sea. I saw a bear by the river, and I missed your stories." Lin smiled softly, folding the pages with care. He took out a brush and ink. That night, by firelight, he wrote replies. Not for trade, not for records, but simply to stay close to the people who mattered, because no matter how long the road was home, always walked beside him. After Bukhara, the land grew quiet again. The road narrowed into a long, empty stretch known by merchants as the Valley of Echoes. It was not dangerous, only strange. A place where every footstep returned to you, whispered back by the canyon walls. When Lin Wei spoke, his voice came back softer, as if the land were listening. The caravan moved slowly. Even the camels seemed more thoughtful, their steps careful on the rocky path. Wind moved through cracks in the stone, making soft tones like flutes in the distance. Sometimes it sounded like laughter, other times like distant music. The apprentices began to speak in whispers, without meaning to. They passed small stone towers built by travelers long ago, markers perhaps, or prayers. Lin paused by one and placed a smooth river stone on top. A small gesture, a quiet message. We passed through. We were here. The journey continues. As the sun dipped behind the rocks, the valley glowed golden, then slowly faded into gray. When they made camp, the fire crackled softly, and the sound bounced off the walls in gentle waves. They slept that night with the stars above, and their own echoes gently keeping watch. The next morning, as the caravan crossed a dry plain of cracked earth, trouble came. A sharp sound, crack, echoed behind them. One of the carts had broken. Its wooden wheel had split where the old iron rim had rusted through. The apprentice driving it jumped down, eyes wide. Lin Wei walked over, calm and steady. He studied the damage, then looked up at the sky. If the sun was rising fast, the heat would soon be strong, gave quiet instructions. The cart was unloaded quickly. Goods were wrapped in cloth and placed beside the road. Lin retrieved a spare wheel, lighter but strong enough, and worked with 2 others to replace the broken piece. It was not fast work. The sun climbed. The camels waited. Dust rose from every step. But by early afternoon, the cart stood ready again. They packed up, drank water in silence, and moved on. No one complained, because all merchants knew the road was long, and patience was the only true map. They had traveled for another 2 days when the land opened unexpectedly. There, nestled between 2 gentle hills, shimmered a lake, still wide and clear as a mirror. It had no name, at least none Lin Wei had ever heard. But travelers knew it. Some called it the Silent Mirror. Others, the Resting Water. To Lin, it was simply beautiful. The caravan stopped at its edge. Camels bent their long necks to drink. The apprentices sat down, shoes off, feet in the cool shallows. One boy skipped stones. Soft plip-plip sounds echoed across the surface. The lake reflected everything. The sky, the trees, the soft clouds, and the quiet faces of those who had come so far. Lin stood alone for a moment, gazing at his own reflection. The wind was still. He thought of all the steps they had taken, across sands, mountains, and cities, and yet here all was still. He knelt and dipped both hands into the water. It was cold and clean, and it felt like a pause, a small gift from the road itself. That night, they slept without tents, just blankets beneath the stars, the lake beside them, holding their dreams in its glassy hands. The next morning, just as the sun rose, a shadow passed above them. Falcon. Its wings cut through the golden sky, circling once, twice, then diving toward a nearby dune. Moments later, a man appeared on horseback. He wore a fur-lined cloak, and on his gloved arm perched the falcon, still and proud. A falconer from the western steppes. The man greeted Lin with a nod. His language was strange, but his smile was warm. He offered dried meat and a small pouch of salt. In return, Lin gave him green tea leaves and a length of ribbon. The two men sat near the lake. They spoke in pieces, using signs, names of cities, sketches in the sand. The falcon sat calmly, eyes sharp, watching everything. Before leaving, the falconer whistled once, and the bird rose high into the morning sky, soared, turned twice, and disappeared. Lin watched until it vanished behind the clouds. The road was filled with such moments, brief meetings, no words, yet full of meaning. And like the falcon, they always flew on. The road turned wide again. Flat golden plains stretched in every direction. The grass was short, and the wind moved across it like water, never stopping, always flowing. After a long afternoon of silence, the towers appeared. The Wind City, that's what the travelers called it. Its real name was older than memory. But the name mattered less than the sound, because in this city, the wind never rested. It hummed through the alleyways, it whispered down the domes. It sang around the minarets like a flute no one ever touched. Linway entered quietly. The city was built of pale stone, low and smooth. Its streets were shaped to guide the breeze, not fight it. Doors were carved with holes that let the air pass through, cooling every room. Wind towers, tall and square, caught the sky's breath and pushed it down into homes. Even the market here was soft. The traders spoke gently, their voices carried away too quickly to shout. Fabrics fluttered, ribbons danced. Wind chimes rang in dozens of tones, light and silver. Lin sat at a tea stall near the edge of the square. His cup barely stayed still. The wind touched everything, even the silence, and so he drank slowly, watching the air move. While in the Wind City, Linway heard of a craftsman, one who worked not in metal or silk, but sandstone. It was said he could carve scenes of the road so finely the wind would pass through them and sing. Lin found him in a quiet alley, seated beneath a canvas cloth. He was an old man, with hands shaped by time. His tools were few, a knife, a brush, and a stone bowl of water. At his side stood a sandstone panel. Carved into it were tiny figures, camels, rivers, stars, and tents, each no taller than a coin. When Lin leaned close, the wind caught the carving, and it made a sound like music in a seashell. He watched in silence. Then, without words, he asked to buy a small piece. The artisan smiled but shook his head. He pointed instead to a flat stone nearby. Then he held up one finger and motioned to Lin's hands. Lin sat, and for the next hour the old man taught him how to hold the knife, how to feel the stone, how to carve not for speed but for meaning. When they were done, Lin had made something small and rough, a camel beneath a moon. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it deep inside his bag, where only the most important things were kept. After many weeks, the caravan reached a place few travelers marked on maps. There were no towns, no markets, no resting posts. Just open land, silent and wide, a sea of golden grass and pale stone under a sky that never ended. It was known only by a simple name, the empty stretch. Here even the wind grew quiet. The caravan moved slower, not from tiredness, but from respect, as if the land itself asked them to step gently. The camels' hooves barely made a sound. The sun seemed softer. Shadows stretched longer. One apprentice whispered, "It feels like the world is listening." Lin nodded. They made no campfires that night. Only small lanterns hung on posts. The stars above were bright, unshaken by cloud or wind. Every sound, the clink of a bowl, the creak of leather, echoed into stillness. Lin Wei took a walk alone after supper, stood at the top of a small hill and looked out. There was nothing in any direction, and yet it felt full of every place they had been, every face they had met, every mile they had walked. The silence here didn't mean empty, it meant complete. He stood there a long time, not moving. The wind finally returned, brushing past him like a gentle hand. The next day brought strong winds again. Dust rose in great slow clouds across the plain. It wasn't dangerous, only tiring. The sky turned pale, and the horizon disappeared. The sun became a round blur in a sea of light. Lin Wei gave the signal. He stopped early and set camp near a patch of low rock. Tents were tied down with thick rope. Camels huddled in a circle, their eyes blinking calmly against the dust. Inside his tent, Lin lit a single paper lantern. It was painted with a river and 2 cranes in flight. The light inside made the colors move. Outside, the wind sang against the cloth. It wasn't harsh, just steady, like a lullaby for those who walked long roads. Lin sat beside the lantern, sipping warm water and writing in his travel book. He wrote, "Today we passed through a place that felt like sky and sea, though we walked on land." He paused, then added some stretches of road. Carry no goods, only memory. And as the wind continued to hum, he closed the book and leaned back. The lantern glowed beside him, like a little sun in the middle of dust and time. After many weeks, the wind began to change. It smelled different now, damp, fresh, and wide. The camels raised their heads. Even Lin Wei felt it in his bones. The sea was near. And then, just beyond a final rise, it appeared. A coastal city, stretched along the edge of the ocean, its white towers leaning into the breeze. Flags fluttered from rooftops. Gulls circled in the sky. Far below, the sea crashed in long, slow waves. This was Tyros, the city of sea winds. Lin had heard its name in stories, but had never seen it. Its streets were made of smooth stone, worn soft by countless feet. Every home had wind windows, open spaces where air passed through freely. And at the city's edge, a vast harbor filled with boats that rocked gently in the tide. He stood quietly, watching sails flutter and water shine. This was not the end of the road, but it felt like a chapter closing. That evening, Lin sat on a wooden deck that overlooked the sea. A kettle boiled slowly over a clay stove. The tea was simple, jasmine and mint. The wind tugged gently at his sleeves. The waves below rolled in steady rhythm like deep breathing. An old woman joined him, the owner of the small tea house. She brought a clay cup and sat beside him without speaking. Together they drank, watching the sunset melt into the water. Lin had walked across deserts, crossed mountains, slept in ruined forts and golden markets. Now he sat still and let the sea do the moving. He thought of his home, far behind him, and his future waiting beyond the sea. But for now, he simply sipped. In the harbor below, a ship waited. It was made of dark wood and had a single pale sail, stitched from old silk and patched with leather. Its hull smelled of salt and pepper, cinnamon and fish, the scent of long travel. This ship was bound for the west, beyond deserts, beyond the edge of maps. Lin walked the gangplank slowly. He looked back once, at the road that had brought him here. Then he stepped aboard. The captain nodded. The crew nodded. No words were needed, only the wind and the rising tide. The ropes were untied. The ship groaned softly, slowly, quietly it left the harbor behind. The nights at sea were gentle. The ship rocked slowly, like a cradle on the waves. Lynn slept beneath the stars, wrapped in a woolen blanket, the sound of water brushing wood beneath him. He dreamed of orchards, of stone cities, of valleys that whispered, of camels, of camels, of blue rivers and red banners. The road never left him. Even here, where no footsteps marked the way, it still walked beside him, in memory, in silence, in dreams. One morning, the ship docked at a small island for water and trade. The islanders wore shells around their wrists and ankles, tiny ones that jingled like bells when they moved. They spoke softly and smiled dizzily. Lynn traded dried tea for a carved shell pendant. One child offered him a stone shaped like a fish, another gave him a handful of sea salt. He stayed for only a few hours, but the sound of the shell bells stayed with him for days. On the 12th day at sea, Lynn stood alone at the front of the ship. The sun set ahead of them, painting the water orange, pink, then violet. Behind him, the east. Via ahead, the west. He stood between two worlds, not lost, not afraid, only present. He let the wind move through him, let the colors rest on his skin. Sometimes the greatest journey was stillness. The captain handed Lynn a map one evening. It was old and incomplete. Some parts were drawn, others were only empty space, marked with wind symbols and small sketches. No names. The captain smiled. You'll write them yourself. Lynn folded the map gently. Sometimes the road isn't about where you go. It's about what you name along the way. At night, the crew used stars to guide their way. Lynn watched the sky with them, learning names for constellations and other tongues. One star, low and gold, always pointed west, began to follow it with his eyes, night after night. It became his compass, his guide, his quiet promise that the journey still had meaning. Lynn wrote a letter one night. It had no name, no address, only thoughts. He wrote about the journey, the people, the tea, the broken cart, the lake with no name. He folded it and placed it in his coat pocket. Not every letter needs to be sent. Some just need to be written. The sea began to shift. Gulls returned. The air smelled of cinnamon and olives. Hills rose on the horizon, the distant shore. People gathered on the deck. Lynn stood among them, eyes open, calm. He had come from a silk-covered city. He had crossed mountains and valleys. And now he arrived not as a stranger, but as part of the road itself. Because no matter where it ends, the journey becomes you. The sea began to shift. Gulls returned. The air smelled of cinnamon and olives. Hills rose on the horizon. The distant shore. People gathered on the deck. Lynn stood among them, eyes open, calm. He had come from a silk-covered city. He had crossed mountains and valleys. Now he arrived not as a stranger, but as part of the road itself. Because no matter where it ends, the journey becomes you.